it can be quite shocking to realize that you have various toxic patterns running through you in your mind and influencing your behaviors, your actions, thus influencing your results in life. It's a difficult thing to overcome because most of the time it's difficult to even observe them. And this is what I want to talk about, because toxic patterns, right, are thinking patterns, or behavioral patterns. There's many aspects to it. But one thing that is not often discussed is the way that we are often oblivious to the way that they actually influence us. I worked on myself, on my own mindset stuff for many years, finding out these toxic patterns and trying to resolve them. And sometimes it took a long while to discover them and to eliminate them even longer. But one thing that always shocked me is realizing how ingrained deeply in me they were, to the degree where I would actually consider them myself. I wouldn't even consider them separate from me. So if you're at a point where you can actually notice that you have a toxic pattern, that's already great. But one thing that you will have to learn is to keep observing it deeper and deeper, observing it to the point where you go to where you feel out the most neutral aspect of that toxic pattern. For example, right? The biggest, weirdest thing about any toxic pattern that you might have is how it integrates in all parts of your life. So you have to understand that a toxic pattern, something that you consider a toxic pattern, is somewhat of a helping mechanism. It makes sense in certain kind of ways. And unless you can recognize that it makes sense in a certain way that I have this, it makes sense in a certain way that I do this, unless you do that, you won't come even close to resolving it. Because here's the thing, the reason why we develop these patterns, right, is just a pattern. It's just a pattern that we call toxic because we're like, I think it's harmful to me. But you have to understand, from a developmental standpoint, it's not toxic, it's just a reaction, a method of dealing with the world. So at a certain point in life, you might have encountered an event which made you want to cope or deal with the world in that way. Now, as you grow older, you might realize this is not really productive. You might smoking weed, drinking alcohol, right? These are the most obvious ones. And then, of course, some years down the line, at first it's just fun. At first it's just relaxing. And then you realize maybe this isn't really good in the long term. And in fact, maybe it's actually harming me. So the first step that you have to take is to really acknowledge that there's a reason for this, okay? It's not just random. It's not just random that I'm doing this. There's a fundamental reason. I'm trying to run away from something. I'm trying to run away, heal, protect, whatever word that you might use, whatever might serve you better in the situation. It's one of those. You're trying to solve a thing, which is why, there's a saying that nature doesn't like a vacuum. In other words, if there's an emptiness somewhere, it will be filled in. And this works for your mind as well. That pattern that you call toxic, that filled you in, is there because there was a need for self-regulation. There was a need for feeling something, for feeling safer, for feeling distracted, for feeling pleasure, whatever it may be. And fundamentally, you won't resolve the issue unless you resolve the underlying reason for the issue to come up in the first place. If you're feeling fear, anxiety, stress, and you sort of self-medicate with alcohol, hey, you might try to stop drinking. But the problem is that you're feeling overly high levels of stress. You have to resolve that. And this is where deep inner work, deep inner mindset work comes in, where you have to learn to regulate yourself. You have to evaluate, for example, why are you getting so stressed out about this in the first place, right? Maybe it's some existential reasons. Maybe it's just changing the attitude you have towards work, towards relationships. Once you do that, right, you establish that framework, that your overall attitude to the thing changes, then you can actually hop on to the other step, which is, okay, maybe there are healthier ways of dealing with this that are actually healthy. Maybe changing in the alcohol with a morning and evening meditation. Maybe you're the kind of person that needs to start working out 4 times a week very intensely to burn up all that stress through working out. Maybe you want to engage in sort of an art therapy thing where you take an instrument or start painting or start doing stuff. Maybe start writing, okay? You have to choose a healthy outlet for that. A lot of people, what they try to do is they try to remove the thing that they don't like, but they don't really change it with anything other. Or what sometimes they do, they try to change it with something, but they're not really heavily invested in the thing. You have to realize this, that you have to invest in another mechanism and another, I guess, coping mechanism, self-regulatory mechanism, but you have to get in very deep with it. And you have to sort of train yourself for a while to get used to the fact that now you're okay with this. So these are the two main things that you have to look into when you want to resolve these toxic patterns. You have to do the first element, which is the sort of a shadow work aspect of it. You have to dig deep in yourself, and this, crawling into that mud of shadow work, it's always nasty, and it has to be nasty. You have to go to the darkest place where you don't want to look. It's very nasty, it's very unpleasant, it's very painful, and you can expect emotional outbursts when you're doing that. On the other hand, you have to develop regulatory mechanisms, self-regulatory mechanisms that will allow you to resolve these stressful states in a healthy manner. If you combine these two, you'll be able to successfully remove that toxic pattern, okay? So it's not a matter of some quick little trick, bam, 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 just doing this. It's about finding the real reasons, understanding them, releasing them as much as you can, and then choosing healthy coping mechanisms, healthy regulatory mechanisms, sort of which I would say, it's unhealthy when it's a coping mechanism. It's healthy when it's a regulatory mechanism, because life is difficult, it's ups and downs, and your psyche gets stimulated, overstimulated, hard stuff happens. You have to have a certain kind of an inner state to get back to, which is why this is kind of why I'm doing this. The reason why I believe in this, it's because I can't believe for so long and so few people know that you do know that you can get into yourself via a platitude, a million of practices, and you can train yourself to get into a state where you feel good, where you feel confident, you feel excited, whatever it may be. You do know that you can actually self-regulate into that. You can cause that for yourself. And yes, it'll take practice. You need to master it as a skill, but it's absolutely possible, okay? So you don't need just a shot of whiskey to get you through the day, okay? You can do it yourself. It's buildable, and that's what I'm interested in. That's what I'm fascinated at. And you can absolutely do that. And I worked through a lot of things, a lot of personal things that I had myself, just following this process. Finding the dirt, getting into the dirt, releasing it, mourning it, and whatever, and then embracing the healthy regulation methods and learning those. And life becomes way better when you do that. You learn to master your mind. Every single % of self-mastery internally that you get drastically improves your actions and your results in life. It just becomes way more interesting, exciting, fascinating to live. And way less harder, I do have to say. It becomes way more interesting. You become way more courageous in life. So embrace those toxic patterns. Remember one thing, let me leave you with one thing, which is, I think, very fascinating. You do realize that those toxic patterns that you have are quite literally the biggest opportunities for growth. And what I mean that, that huge excitement that maybe you had when you were a kid? That creativity that you had? That courage that you had? When you would look through the window and think, oh, what a beautiful day. This is what is waiting for you at the other side of dealing with those toxic patterns. So it's not that just you deal with them and you'll be neutral. Then you'll be able to access states of joy, excitement, motivation, and flow, which you may have forgotten for years and years. They're still accessible. They're still inside you, and you can absolutely access them if you do the work. So do the work, okay? Do the work, and it'll be way brighter on the other side.